Thank you for joining us for this MDA Engage community webinar on speech equipment. My name is Sarah Fuchs, and I am a community education specialist at MDA. We are thrilled to have you join us today for this important and educational webinar. The webinar today is a part of our larger MDA Engage community programs, which focus on bringing the neuromuscular disease community together around education and resources. Be sure to visit the MDA Engage section on mda.org for updates on upcoming virtual education events. We are recording today's event and will be posting it to the mda.org website for on-demand viewing to ensure those who are not able to join us live today are able to access this information. Please know that all phone lines have been muted. We will be having a question and answer session at the end of the webinar. Please be sure to utilize the Q&A window to type in your questions if you are watching us live. If you hover your cursor over the bottom of the screen, you will see a question mark. Click on that and enter your question. You do not need to wait until the Q&A session to chat in your questions. As questions come up, please feel free to send those in and we will address them at the end. Before I begin, I would like to say thank you to our speaker today, Carrie Reichwein, whom you will meet shortly. For over 70 years, MDA has led the way in accelerating research, advancing care, and advocating for the support of our families. MDA's mission is to empower people living with muscular dystrophy, ALS, and related neuromuscular diseases to live longer and more independent lives. Our mission comes to life through these four pillars. Care, through our national network of MDA care centers across the US, we support individuals and families from day one of their journey. Champion, through our advocacy and education efforts, we empower families with information and resources. Catalyst, through our investments in research, we are furthering advancements in treatment discoveries. Community, through programs like Summer Camp, our Connections program, our community events, we are helping individuals and families build supportive connections and relationships. If you haven't done so already, we invite you to join the MDA community by registering with us. Please see the link in the chat. Let's review the objectives for today's webinar. We will understand how neuromuscular disease might affect speech. We will review the types of equipment and assistive devices for communication. You will know what questions to ask and factors to consider when selecting equipment. And we will discuss the process for obtaining speech equipment. Now, it is my honor to introduce today's speaker, Carrie Reichwein. Carrie is a speech-language pathologist at the Penn State Hershey Medical Center and Penn State Hershey ALS Clinic and Research Center. She completed her Bachelor of Science in Communication Sciences and Disorders at Penn State University and received a Master of Science degree in Speech-Language Pathology from Bloomsburg University. She has worked at Penn State Hershey since 2008. Carrie has extensive experience across the continuum of care with both pediatric and adult patients, including acute care, inpatient rehabilitation, and outpatient settings, and her clinical areas of interest and specialty include neurology, neurodegenerative disease, and augmentative and alternative communication, AAC. In addition to her clinical experience as a speech pathologist, she is also involved in various research projects through the neurology department and has been an instructor at Bloomsburg University for both undergraduate and graduate level students in the field of speech pathology. She is passionate about improving meaningful, functional outcomes and enhancing quality of life for her patients. Carrie, thank you for sharing your time and expertise with us today. I will now turn the time over to you.
Just kind of defining some terms. I think sometimes when we talk about communication, we hear the word speech, you hear language, you hear voice, you hear all these words, and they do mean a little bit different things. So just to clear some of that up to start, when we hear the word speech, we're referring to how we say the sounds and words. So our articulation, how we articulate the sounds in the words. Our voice, the actual production of sound. And fluency is kind of how the sounds flow together to make our sentences and our speech patterns. And then we have language. And that language is composed of the words that we use and the rules that govern how we use them. We're not going to get into great detail. I could give you an hour-long presentation just about the components of language. But language encompasses the meaning behind our words. It gives us rules on how we combine different sounds to make new words. It tells us rules about how we combine words together to make logical sentences. And it also tells us rules about how we use different words at different times. So obviously we all know that there's different words that have multiple meanings. And when we understand a language, we understand those rules. Whether we can consciously recall where we learned them, we just know our language rules. It's important to understand with language that when we are talking with other people and other partners, our communication partners, we all have to understand the same language, or else we miss a lot. So if you ever are talking with a speaker of a language that you don't understand, and you don't understand the rules and the culture associated with that language, a lot of our meaning gets missed and lost. So this kind of comes up a little bit when we talk about augmentative and alternative communication. So I just kind of wanted to review those terms with you. And then communication is the active process of exchanging information and ideas. It involves understanding, also referred to as comprehension, and it involves expression. And I think this point here at the bottom is important to remember. When communication is effective, a person, the communicator, is able to express themselves, that whether that's their needs, their wants, their feelings, their preferences, in a way that others can understand. So I think a lot of the times we all think of communication as just being speech. When we start talking about using different forms of communication, different alternative and augmentative options, sometimes I think we get hung up on speech and we forget that the conveyance of a message is the goal of communication. So that might look very different for everybody. And we should reward or celebrate any successful message that's conveyed. So we'll talk about that a little bit later, but we just need to remember that communication is the message being exchanged, not just speech. So when you see the term AAC, augmentative alternative communication, augmentative it simply means we're adding to somebody's speech. So we are giving the person something on top of their speech to help them communicate. Alternative refers to options that we use instead of speech. So they kind of go hand in hand, but not always. So sometimes people augment their speech and other times people are not able to augment because they might not have any speech. So that's when we would use alternative. So again, all the ways that people communicate besides talking is considered AAC. AAC is used by people of all ages. Their use, it may be temporary, it may be lifelong. There's several different options and types. We're going to talk about that a little bit later. And ideally, AAC will incorporate the patient or the person's full communication abilities. We refer to that as multimodal. So it's very rare that you see a person just communicating with one method. Even right now, you probably can't see what my hands are doing, but I talk with my hands. So I gesture, we use facial expressions, you hear my speech. So right there is three different modes of communication. When we're working with individuals with communication challenges, we really want to encourage that multimodal communication. Any way that they can convey their message is good. And then sometimes you need some help, and that's where sometimes the professionals like myself or others come in to kind of help find some of these other AAC options. And the use of AAC may change over time. That could depend on the person's needs, the change in their status, any updates in technology or devices. So it just depends. So, you know, sometimes I work with patients who just need a short-term option for communication. You know, maybe maybe they're having surgery and they have to go on vocal rest for a couple weeks. You know, so maybe they just need some ideas on how to compensate for that for a couple weeks. On the flip side, you know, we have patients that are born with communication challenges, and we start working with that from day one. Other times we have acquired disabilities or impairment, and that may start later in life. So again, the people that use AAC, again, I mentioned it can be anybody of all age. I think many of times, if any of you are connected with the pediatric world, a lot of the times we hear other professionals or parents or people thinking or saying that before somebody can use AAC, they need to have these certain skills, or they need to be at a certain knowledge level, or they have to master certain milestones in development before we can introduce AAC to them. And that is just not true. We found that AAC can be beneficial and helpful at any stage of development. Obviously, it's going to look very different from a 1-year-old or a 2-year-old versus a 13 versus a 50-year-old, based on those skills and knowledge. But in order to be helpful, there really aren't any specific skills or milestones that need to be met. A lot of times people also ask, I hear this more in the pediatric population, but also I hear this in the adult population when we're talking about an acquired communication disorder. If somebody uses AAC, you know, if my child uses AAC, is it going to hinder their language and speech development because we're giving them alternate options? And the answer is no. I always explain it that, you know, the person's going to use the path of least resistance. So we can equate it to learning sign language as a child. You know, if you teach a baby how to sign more and they start using that while they're eating, you know, more. The second that child learns how to say more and they can speak, they're going to drop the sign and they're going to switch into speech, because speech is it's just easier, it's faster, and it's understood by more people than that sign language may be. It's the same with AAC. So sometimes we see children using AAC during their developmental period, while they're still also working on speech and language development. And the use of AAC can actually sometimes help promote speech and language development. So if you're somebody out there who's asking that question, or, you know, have been told that it will hinder speech and language, the research consistently shows that that's not true. Another question that I get a lot, working with primarily my adult population, is if a person is using AAC, or if we give them a device, or we give them these options, are they going to be less motivated to talk? And again, the answer is no. Because again, speaking is always going to be the fastest, it's going to be the most easily understood by others, and it's going to be always the go-to of the person if they can. So those are some things that I want you to keep in mind if that was a concern, or if you ever had that question. So approximately 2 million people, it's estimated, are presenting with significant expressive difficulty, and they're using AAC. Again, I already mentioned, you know, some of the people who are using AAC may have congenital impairments that began at birth, or they may have acquired impairments, sometime during the lifetime after birth. People that are using AAC are from a variety of diagnoses. You know, autism, cerebral palsy, genetic syndromes, intellectual disabilities, hearing impairment, disease processes, brain injuries, stroke, neuromuscular disease, etc. The list is it goes on and on. But those are just some common diagnoses that we see of people that are using AAC. So when we talk about AAC, there's a lot of this, there's different types or different ways that we approach AAC. So there's what we call unaided AAC options. And this is really any mode of communication that includes non-spoken means of natural communication. So for example, gestures. If I said, I think you all would get the gist that I want you to get me a drink, right? Or if I go, I didn't say anything, but you saw my facial expression, you saw my gestures, my activity, that indicates that I'm cold. Same thing with hot. So those are all gestures, signs that we do to communicate, right? And they're not obviously all universal, but I think you understand that those are unaided. I'm not using speech, but I'm also not using other devices to do those. So that's what we refer to as unaided. Natural communication, non-spoken. Then we also have aided AAC or aided options. And is simply anything that requires some form of external support. So some examples would be, using a communication board, a computer, a phone, things like that. You also might hear these terms referred to, you might hear no tech, low tech. We prefer the term rapid access. These are kind of like down and dirty, fast ways you can communicate if you get yourself stuck in a situation. So they don't necessarily require a lot of technology. Rapid access is a term we kind of prefer in the field because I feel like sometimes when you hear low tech or no tech, it indicates that maybe they're like lesser quality or they're not as good as some of the high tech devices. And sometimes these rapid access methods are faster and easier to use than the high tech technology out there. So again, gestures, facial expressions, writing, drawing. You can spell, maybe using a letter board, pointing to letters, sometimes pointing to photos, pictures, words. Those can be really fast and effective ways to communicate. So that's why we like to call them rapid access. And then, of course, we have some of the high-tech AAC that we're going to talk about a little bit later, including apps, on our phones and our tablets, computers that maybe have voice output programs. Those are kind of more of the higher tech devices. And I think it's important to understand that ideally, somebody that's an AAC user uses a combination of these options. I would never want to recommend just one method or one type of AAC for somebody, because let's be real, things fail, right? Computers, we have problems all the time with technology. Phones, they're great. There's lots of apps available. There's lots of great technology, but sometimes we forget to charge them, and then we're trying to use them and they don't turn on. So technology is awesome when it's working, but you may or may not always have access to that. We also try to avoid things that are 100% dependent on the internet, because again, we know we go places a lot where there may or may not be internet access. So it's nice to have a combination of some of the rapid access or lower tech options that a person can use, as well as some higher tech options. I kind of explain it's just like a toolbox. You may have your fancy eye gaze communication device, that's in your toolbox. You may have a writing tablet and a pencil, that's in your toolbox. You might have a little pocket card that you carry in your wallet that has some basic yes, no, and an alphabet board. That's also in your toolbox. And depending on the situation or the party that you're communicating with, you pick a different tool. So today in this talk, I'm not going to get super specific about different devices. I didn't want to. I could give you an entire lecture about just eye gaze or just low tech, but I just kind of want to put a couple pictures up of some things that you may see and that can be used as AAC devices or options. So the picture up at the top, it's just a guy giving the okay symbol. That's a gesture. Okay, that's AAC. In the middle, we have the alphabet board. So again, somebody can just point to letters. You can use alphabet boards with communication partners with partner-assisted scanning. You spell to communicate. We have a picture of an iPad on the left there. There's tons of communication apps out there geared towards every population out there. There are picture-based systems for younger children who may not have literacy skills yet. There are high-tech or higher literacy skills apps out there where people have to be able to read to use them. There's a combination of the both. There are page sets developed by these apps for patients with very specific diagnoses. So you could Google or you could search in the App Store for whatever the diagnosis is that you're working with, and you can probably find an app that is specific to that. So the world of technology, these apps have been life-changing. Many of them are free or very low cost. On the flip side, there are some that are more robust that have a cost associated, but they're still always going to be cheaper usually than buying or getting a dedicated speech device, which we'll talk about them. The picture in the middle is the black case around it. That is an example of a more complex speech generating device. That one is using pictures set up. These devices can be used with eye gaze if a person's mobility or function is decreased and they only have access to using their eyes. That would be more considered a very high-tech device. The thing on the bottom, I don't know if you guys, a lot of people are familiar with them. It's called a Boogie Board. It's just a writing tablet, not created specifically for AAC, but we use it around the house. Maybe write a shopping list. A lot of my patients and a lot of people just use them. They're quick, they're cheap. You can get them, at your local Staples. You can order them online. They're really handy to have. Just kind of throw in a bag, throw in a purse. We use them a lot in our hospital setting. So somebody that may have had a recent a throat surgery or cancer related surgery and just needs something short-term to write, that's a really nice option. Then you see the picture of that phone screen. That's an example of an app, maybe on a phone, where you would just type in onto your phone and then it will speak for you. And obviously on the bottom is just a paper and pencil. We all use AAC every day. We don't really think about it being AAC, but it is a form of AAC. So when we write, we're augmenting our spoken communication. When we text, when we email, those are all nonverbal ways of communication. And then that picture up on the top with the guy in the green shirt, some of you may recognize him as Steve Gleason. He is using an eye gaze device mounted to his wheelchair. So just to give you a couple ideas of what AAC may look like, but there's tons out there. It's hard to keep up sometimes because it changes every day. So I have patients come in and they tell me they're using an app and I never heard of it because every day there's something new coming out, which is awesome. So again, types of AAC, we already kind of touched on this. We want to encourage the use of any and all modes of communication. We may need to teach the user and their communication partners when it's appropriate to use different modes for different communication settings. So for example, a person may communicate one way in their home with their family versus a different way in school versus a different way in more of a casual situation with their friends, depending on the topics, depending on the partners and their comfort and ability to use it to respond to AAC, and also the language and the speech capabilities of the person. So when we're trying to decide, how we're going to proceed with AAC and what options we're going to give the person, there's a lot of things. Some of these decisions are made by professionals, and I think there's a lot more to it sometimes than what we might think. So we need to consider how the person is going to access the device, how they're going to select their targets when they're communicating. So there's lots of switches out there. If any of you are AAC users and you use switches, you may be familiar, but there is something as simple as a round, like a button switch, where you push the button. That would be like a larger target for somebody that maybe has significant motor. They don't have good fine motor control. We also, on the flip side, have switches that are activated using finite, like tiny muscle activation movements using surface EMG switches. So maybe a person might be completely paralyzed, not able to outwardly move any muscles, but they may be able to activate, that we can't see, they may be able to activate a muscle in the eyebrow or the cheek or the shoulder or the thigh, just enough to activate an EMG switch. So I have some patients who are using these surface EMG switches when all else fails, and they can be very successful. So again, working with professionals who can kind of help evaluate these and look at your specific needs and what access methods and selection methods is really key. It's really crucial to work with a professional who understands all the different nuances involved in AAC. Positioning, really huge for AAC. We need to really be able to look at the person and look at their motor abilities as well as their limitations. We need to understand how the disease process works. Is this just a congenital illness or a diagnosis that is going to stay the same throughout the lifespan? Or is the person's motor capabilities today going to look very different than they may in a year? So those are some really important factors we need to consider. Often speech pathologists are the ones working primarily with AAC, but we also collaborate a lot with physical therapy, occupational therapy, with wheelchair vendors. We have to get really good at working with our other multidisciplinary team to figure out the best way sometimes to access these devices. It's also really important to consider the current skills, strengths, and needs of the person using the AAC, but we also don't want to limit or restrict their potential. So we want to, ideally, you want to get a device or an option of communication that allows growth and allows a little bit more, like we don't want to like put a wall up where the person can only go this far. We want to, that potential, we always want to assume that there's potential for more. I think this first point here is important to remember. Just because somebody has speech, so the presence of speech should not preclude consideration of AAC. So I hear this a lot. As Sarah mentioned in my introduction, I work in our ALS clinic at Penn State Hershey, and a lot of the times I hear a lot of patients say they don't want to even hear about AAC, that they don't want to talk about it because they can talk. And we want you to talk. I want all of my patients to be able to talk. The same thing goes for pediatrics. We may have pediatric patients who can talk, but not super successfully. We always are going to encourage talking as your number one go-to. But just because you can talk should not automatically throw out all the AAC options. Because again, we're going to look at it like I described as a toolbox. Speech is a tool, writing is a tool, texting is a tool, maybe using an eye gaze machine. You may or may not be using them all at the same time, but having all of those tools in your toolbox is only going to help you if you get yourself into a situation where you're not able to communicate. So some patients or some people have some speech, and it may or may not be what we refer to as intelligible. So if somebody's speech is intelligible, that just means it's able to be understood. So if you hear the term unintelligible, that just means that a person can't understand them. So a lot of times we have patients that are able to be understood by those that are closest to them, family members, friends, people that are around them all the time. If you can kind of even look back to if any of you have children, when they were babies, maybe they were babbling, it made no sense to anybody else but you knew that when they said that sound that it meant ball or, bottle. It's kind of the same thing here. Familiar partners understand the speech, but the unfamiliar communication partner might not understand that person's speech. So in a situation like that, maybe you use your speech in the more low demand interactions or the more comfortable or familiar interactions, and then you use the AAC options in the more high demand or unfamiliar communication settings. We also need to think about the fact that not all communication partners are able to understand the messages from various communication devices. So we just need to make sure that if we're recommending somebody's using a voice output device, for example, and their spouse maybe has hearing difficulties, we need to make sure that they're compatible. I can't tell you how many times, and maybe some of you have had this happen, where the patient themselves is able to communicate one way or the other, whether it's AAC or talking, but the spouse can't hear because their hearing aids aren't turned on or they're not wearing their hearing aids. That's just one example. So we always want to make sure, that goes for AAC or not, we always want to make sure that when we're communicating that our partner is able to understand our message successfully. So when we start talking about neuromuscular disease more specifically, those of you who are living with neuromuscular disease or are a caregiver or a loved one of somebody with neuromuscular disease, a lot of this information is probably not new, but just wanted to quickly review, a lot of the times when you have a neuromuscular diagnosis, we often present with weakness in the bulbar muscles. So the bulbar muscles are the muscles that are involved with speech and swallowing. You may or may not have respiratory muscles that weaken. A lot of the times this muscular weakness progresses with disease progression and over time. With neuromuscular disease, you often see positioning challenges due to weakness. Also, sometimes we see challenges due to spasticity or increased muscle tone that can make things tricky. And a common term that you may hear in this world is called dysarthria. And that's just really kind of our medical term or our official term for slurred speech or impaired speech. So out in the world, there's lots of different types of dysarthria, a lot of different causes of dysarthria. But when we're talking about a neuromuscular disease process, a lot of the times the characteristics of speech are pretty commonly seen the same. We often see slurred sounding speech or imprecise articulation. We often see a slowed rate of speech, decreased volume, decreased respiratory drive and decreased respiratory support. We may have a lower volume of speech because we're not able to provide the respiratory support necessary for good volume. We may or may not hear what we refer to as a hypernasal resonance. This is when the palatal muscles are weak and they're not able to meet the back of the throat and rise like they normally should. And sometimes air can escape into the nasal passage and it kind of gives you that nasal sounding voice. We hear that a lot with neuromuscular diseases. You may hear a breathy, a rough or raspy vocal quality. Also due to changes with the muscles involved in voice production. So we also see sometimes what we describe as a strained or strangled or like tight sounding voice. Sometimes it comes out sounding like this because the muscles are actually increased in tone and there's spasticity down there in those muscles squeezing, and that can make it really hard to communicate as well. Usually we see dysarthria worsening as the disease progresses. So I also wanted to bring up the topic of voice banking, voice and message banking. So this is something that I would hope those of you living with neuromuscular disease are familiar with. And if not, I would really encourage you to talk to a speech pathologist or a professional that you've been working with to talk about maybe trying to do some of this. So when we're diagnosed with an illness that has the potential to lose or significantly alter our communication abilities, we always want to try to consider if we can do some voice recording. This can be used in many different ways, and really it's personal preference, but it's basically recording your voice for use in the future. Whether we'll talk about a little bit in the next slide. But I recommend if you're going to do this, if you're interested in recording, you want to do this as soon as possible while your speech and voice are relatively intact, if you can. It gives you the best quality sounding recordings, but also it sounds the most like yourself. So for my new diagnoses or a patient that I know maybe not related to neuromuscular, but maybe he's having a laryngectomy because of throat cancer. As soon as I can get the information to that person, these people, I want to get it to them. As soon as we know that there's even a possibility of losing voice. Because if we do it early, you sound more like yourself and you're able to really give high quality recordings that sound better. There is assistance available through certain programs and funding through various foundations and grants out there. I'm not going to get into specific funding options during this webinar because there's so many different foundations, there's so many different diagnoses that we deal with. But if you are interested in doing this, I would encourage you to talk to your local, the chapter of an association that you're affiliated with, or even just research online grants available, maybe connected with your diagnosis, to see if they would help cover the cost of some of this. So when we say voice banking, that's kind of a more structured process of recording words and phrases into a computer program. And then what it does is it takes that recording and it creates a synthetic voice that you can then later use with a speech generating device. So down the road, if you end up using a speech generating device, instead of hearing the more computerized or robotic sounding voice, you can use this synthetic voice that sounds much more like yourself. Again, ideally, this is done if you're going to do the structured process. It's ideally done before we hear a significant change, because it wants the best quality sound files to create that voice. If you're a person, or if you're working with a person who has unfortunately lost their voice or their speech, or it's really impaired, some of these programs are able to use previous recordings. So if you have home videos or just recordings of yourself talking, they can sometimes create a synthetic voice with that if it's enough. Sometimes family members donate their voice. So I have a mother who has ALS, and her daughter. So unfortunately, she decided too late in her journey that she wanted to make a voice for her device. But her daughter sounds very much like her. So her daughter did the voice recording for her, and they're using that voice because her speech may not be ideal. Also, if you don't have anybody to donate a voice, there are voice banks out there of people that have donated their voice for this exact purpose. So those are always options as well. We also have something that we refer to as message banking. So this also is recording, but it's a little less structured. It can be more personal, more meaningful. It can literally be anything that you want to record. Some examples are, there's recordable photo albums out there. So if you have young children or young grandchildren or anybody, you can get these recordable photo albums online. They're about $20. Record a 10-second recording on each page. I encourage patients and maybe their spouses to do it together. It feels a little weird and a little sad sometimes to think about the patient themselves doing this alone. But I tell people, do it together. Make it a fun activity. Do it as a Christmas gift, as a Hanukkah gift, as an Easter gift, birthday present. Have some fun with it. Photo albums, recording storybooks for young children, grandparents with maybe young children, 2, 3, 4-year-olds, make recordable storybooks. You can just talk, personal messages, tell them stories about your life, tell them stories about what they did when they were little kids. Think about important dates that may or may not happen in the future, that you may or may not be able to communicate with. So I think sometimes when I have patients who are fathers or mothers, and they have children who may be getting married, I think, okay, well, think about maybe if you're at the wedding, but you're not able to communicate, is there anything that you'd like to record today that you could then play on that wedding day? These can be really hard topics to talk about as a professional, but it's also really, really hard to think about as a patient and a family. But I really encourage you, if this is something you're interested in, to try to do it and try to think about how you can do these things. Because just think in general, if you had a gift like this from your parent or your loved one, how meaningful that would be after they've either passed away or lost their communication. So I try to talk about this early. I try to talk about it in a positive way, so that way you guys can see that there are lots of options out there, and you can really, really give a really meaningful gift to your family and loved ones by doing this. The acceptance of AAC is something that we also need to consider when we're working with this. Sometimes it's hard for people to think about the potential loss of communication. I always try not to bombard people, but I try to have the discussion early if I'm working with somebody with a diagnosis where this isn't a possibility. Even if they're completely normal, their speech is not really affected. I try to do it, again, not in a super depressing way, but we need to at least keep this in the back of our mind, because I find that I have the same conversation sometimes over and over, and it takes a couple times for the person hearing it to be willing to accept that they're willing to try AAC. Because again, none of us want to have to use these options. None of us want to think about not being able to communicate. So it can be very distressing. It can be very depressing. So sometimes we have to hear it multiple times. So if that's somebody that, if that's something that you've experienced, you probably understand what I'm talking about. There's also differences in acceptance, you know, based on age, the diagnosis, the prognosis, et cetera. So a lot of times patients who have a degenerative disease that they are seeing decline in function, a lot of the times they're very willing to accept AAC because they see the loss, they see the progression, they see and live the frustration of seeing their communication go away. Those patients I find are very accepting a lot of the times. When it comes to somebody that maybe had a stroke, for example, they're usually not quite as accepting of AAC because they want to improve. So again, it really depends on the patient's situation and their diagnosis. Okay, so how the heck do I get an AAC device? That is a question that a lot of people have. So in general, it should be a very collaborative approach. It should include the patient, the family, their medical professionals working with them. But ultimately the evaluation, however the person is evaluated for a device and whatever is recommended, it needs to be done by a person who is experienced with AAC. I cannot stress this enough. If you would have talked to me 10 years ago and asked me to do an AAC eval for you, I would have declined, because while we all learn about AAC, it's about this much. Unless you actually go into the field and continue working with it and stay current with it, it's not ethical or appropriate to be recommending and evaluating if you don't know what you're doing. So if you're working with a speech pathologist who may be an excellent speech pathologist, but just doesn't have that AAC experience, it is absolutely okay and encouraged that you ask for a referral to somebody that may have the ability to help you with that. Oftentimes it is a speech language pathologist, just because it's our kind of our wheelhouse. What we do is we should be completing comprehensive evaluations that address all of the areas that I previously addressed: positioning, access, motor function, cognitive function, language function, visual function. Again, I may not be actually doing a vision exam on you, but I need to know what your abilities and what your impairments are to help recommend the appropriate access. Ideally, you should be trying different devices, different access methods, different positioning before making recommendations for devices. Again, I already mentioned the speech pathologist may collaborate with PT, with OT, with a wheelchair vendor, anybody. We have a team usually that we work with to find the optimum positioning and access options if we need to. We also need to consider and work on determining medical necessity. So if you're getting a device and it's funded by insurance, Medicare, Medicaid, they usually want to see, not usually, they need to see medical necessity. They like to not approve things if they don't have to. So that's why, again, it's crucial to work with a therapist who is familiar with these and familiar with just writing the right terminology and determining medical necessity. Because if I don't determine the appropriate medical necessity for you, your device is not going to get covered, and then it's just going to continue to be a process. And we certainly don't want somebody that needs a device to get denied just because of lack of awareness or lack of knowledge of how to do it. We also follow up with our patients if needed for training, programming, with changing devices around as their skills and needs change. There's also a lot of support out there in the AAC world from the actual device companies that make the devices. So there's a lot of people involved with making these decisions and helping provide the support and follow-up that you need. Again, I'm not going to get into specific grants and foundations today, but you should just know that there are a lot of funding options out there to help pay for in entirety or to offset the cost of devices. So some of these devices can be very costly. You know, an average eye gaze device with the appropriate mounting system is around $18,000. So I don't know about you, but I don't have that laying around to just throw on a communication device. Most people, that's a burden. Insurance is a funding source. Medicare, Medicaid, there are grants available, you know, through different associations that may be affiliated with the diagnosis that you're talking about. If the person is in school, oftentimes the school is able to provide the device. There's also lending libraries. You know, every state has a lending library, or like a loaner system that you can look into. Often clinics, you know, whether it's the ALS clinic or an MDA clinic or whatever clinic that you're attending, if you go to a clinic, a lot of the times we have loan closets available with donated devices. That usually goes for wheelchairs, walkers, bedside commodes, etc. All DME. We usually have a closet of loaners available. There's certain things, like certain rules, like hospice won't pay for DME usually. So that's when these loan closets and these grants can really come in and be helpful. If you're a veteran, the VA is amazing with funding some of these things. Certain diagnoses are determined to be veteran affiliated, and they are 100% supported, and those are options to look into as well. So again, it's important to work with professionals who understand the rules and the different associations on how to get these devices so that they're paid for and that they're appropriate for what you need. The timing of the evaluation is also really important to understand. Insurance only pays for one device every 5 years, and that's a pretty strict rule across the board. So that's really important to keep in mind as a patient as well as a professional. When we're recommending devices, we want to make sure that whatever we're getting today is going to be appropriate in 4 years and 9 months. Because I don't want to get you a device today that you can only access with your hands and it doesn't have the option for eye gaze if I think you're going to need eye gaze down the road. Because then what would happen is if you lose the ability to use your hands, we're going to have a really hard, if not impossible, time getting an eye gaze device funded down the road. So again, that just comes with experience and just knowing the timing and knowing the diagnoses that you're working with. So again, I just really encourage you to talk with professionals who feel very comfortable in these areas. I just included this little slide here at the end. This is what we refer to as brain-computer interface, BCI. This is kind of the future of technology. It's being used right now in the communication world, mostly in the research world. We have some research projects going on. I know there's communication companies out there working with brain-computer interfaces. But how this is going to work, it's these, you can see the picture of the person wearing the cap. Those are surface electrodes, and they're tracking her brain waves. And she is communicating by spelling. You can see the alphabet board on the right, just by thinking. So she's not blinking, she's not pushing a button, she's not doing anything other than thinking about what she's trying to spell. And the leads are reading her brain waves and translating that into communication. So again, that can be very, it's kind of crazy and wild to think about, but that's kind of where we're headed in the field of AAC. I'm really excited about what's going to happen with that down the road. We're already seeing its use in robotics and in arm and leg function, but I'm really excited to see where it goes in the future with communication. I wanted to end with just a slide of some possible available resources. There are so many more out there. I just listed some of the well-known ones that I have worked with a lot. The American Speech Language Hearing Association, ASHA, they have tons of information out there on any topic related to speech, swallowing, communication, anything that you would have a question about. ASHA has some great information and resources. There's the International Society for AAC. RESNA is a great resource as well for not just communication, but also DME and equipment. For those of us in the ALS world, the Gleason Foundation is an excellent funding source and resource center. They're excellent to work with. The MDA, who we are with today, obviously, excuse me, also an excellent resource for education, for helping to facilitate equipment and clinics, multidisciplinary clinics around the country. We also have the ALS Association. Also, for those patients with ALS, provides great resources, great information, and also does multidisciplinary clinics. The Boston Children's Hospital AAC program. We use this resource a lot. They have excellent online resources and information for patients available, and it's all free. So you can check that out. And then just checking out different AAC company websites. Obviously, they're a little bit more biased towards their own devices, but I've found that they have some excellent trainings, excellent resources, and information available out there. So here are just the references that I used to kind of quote some of the information I gave you today. I think we're going to turn it over to question and answer, and I'm happy to try and answer any questions that you might have.
Yes, thank you so much, Carrie. Give me just a second here. All right, again, thank you, Carrie. I would now like to open the webinar to any questions that our audience might have. Just a reminder, the Q&A box is at the bottom of your screen. You can click on the question mark and type in your question. So I can give a few minutes for questions. And it looks like I do not see any questions. So let's see here. We can wait a couple more minutes if you want. Yes, I do not see any questions now.
Okay, I am available. I mean, obviously, Sarah and Marissa, you have my contact information. So if anybody thinks of any questions after the fact, or even in a month or two, you know, you think of a question and you think that I may be able to help you or else or guide you, I'm happy, you know, you can share my contact information with them, and I'm happy to share that.
Absolutely. No, and you can always contact the MDA Resource Center to get in touch with us with any questions, and we can always, you know, consult with Carrie if, you know, she can help answer any of those questions. They're also great for finding resources and helping to locate those resources. So again, I would like to thank our guest presenter, Carrie Reichschwein. We sincerely appreciate your time and expertise and everything you do for the neuromuscular community.
You're welcome. I am noticing, Sarah, there is a question from Graham in the chat box that just popped up, saying, thank you for discussing voice and message banking. Please send information on how to set this up. So I can, I'm not sure about the best way. I'd be happy to send out some more information about that. If you want me to send that to either Marissa or Sarah, I could do that. And then if anybody that's interested, you could just disseminate that, whatever you think is, but I do have some more written information that is helpful, if that's helpful.
Great. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
So for everyone else, we would love to hear your comments about this webinar. If you have a smartphone, you can open your camera and point it at the QR code on the screen. A web page will pop up with a short survey about today's webinar. If you do not have a smartphone, once the webinar is over, a screen will pop up with the survey as well. If anyone has any questions after this webinar, feel free to email those questions to mdaengage@mdausa.org, and we will follow up with you. If you are new to MDA through this program and are diagnosed with a neuromuscular disease under MDA's umbrella, or are a loved one of someone who is diagnosed, we encourage you to stay engaged with MDA. You can do this by visiting mda.org/join and completing a short form. This will keep you up to date on the latest information and education to help keep your family informed in the neuromuscular community. So this concludes today's MDA Engage webinar on speech equipment. Thank you very much for attending and have a great rest of your day.
Sarah, sorry to interrupt you again. I just noticed there was another question. It looks like the question and answer comment it was hard for some people to see. So somebody wrote in the chat box that they're struggling with volume and asking what equipment is an example to help with that. So Chuck, if you're still on, or and some other people commented the same, a very quick and easy way to help with volume is getting a personal voice amplifier. They are available online. Usually I recommend people just go to Amazon. It's just basically a little box that you would wear on you could put it in your pocket, you can wear it on your hip, and it has a little microphone, and it will just amplify your voice a little bit. And they have some that a partner could also have a receiver in a different room to help to hear you if you're talking in a different room. So that's a simple way. And another thing that I also recommend for volume, it sounds very kind of basic, but try to focus on upright positioning, upright posture, and try to take as deep of a breath as you can to help give yourself the airflow needed for increasing volume. I recognize that that's a lot of times easier said than done when we have breathing difficulty and changes in the respiratory muscles, but sometimes just by really focusing on our breath and our posture, taking a nice deep breath and maybe breathing a little bit more while we're talking helps to provide more support for volume.
Perfect. Thank you so much.
Okay, well, if there's not any other questions, then thank you all again for having me. I really appreciate it.
Yes, thank you so much again, Carrie, and everyone else. Have a great rest of your day, and thank you so much for joining us.